made in honor of Shabbos is the fulfillment of the mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos, even just a kasa de harsena, dish or small fish mixed with flour and fried in its own oil, forming a type of fish cake, this is even acceptable because you made the special effort and had it in mind. Then it says here, Rabbi Akiva's statement says, treat your Shabbos as an ordinary weekday rather than become dependent on others. Okay, it says a person who has the means to do so must indeed celebrate Shabbos as lavishly as he can afford. Regarding a person who can afford just 2 meals on Shabbos with no extras, Rabbi Akiva said, treat your Shabbos as a weekday rather than become dependent upon others. Such a person is not obligated to have the third meal, nor is he obligated to prepare even the classic fish cake, as mentioned earlier. A person who has enough money for 3 Shabbos meals plus a little more money should use that money for Shabbos to fulfill the mitzvah of having 3 meals plus a minimal addition exemplified by Chazal, such as the fish cake. Okay, let's do the next point next time. Okay.
So, what we said in summary is, may the share be a refuah for all the sick of Klal Yisrael, including our dear friend Kevin Mayerthal. And thanks for teaching us to start having COVID. Really, Kevin, I appreciate it very much. Okay, so just in review, in a few sentences from yesterday, the ending part, Rav Chanina taught in the Brisa, if a householder, which is an unpaid custodian, claims that a deposit he was safekeeping was stolen, and he swore to that effect, but then admitted that in fact he took the item for himself, that he'd sworn falsely that somebody else stole it, and then witnesses came and testified that he took the item for himself. The law is as follows. If he admitted his guilt before the witnesses came and testified against him, he pays the principal and 1/5 surcharge, and he brings an asham offering. But if he admitted his guilt only after witnesses come and testified against him, he then pays the 2-fold payment for obviously being caught lying and stealing, and in addition, he brings an asham offering, but his 1/5 surcharge is accounted for with his 2-fold payment, providing the amounts are identical. These are the words of Rav Yaakov. So we're saying that there would be a 2-fold payment and a 1/5 surcharge if the amounts of the 1/5 surcharge, which is based on the principle, was not identical to the kefil payment, which was the knas, the penalty payment. But if the amounts were, however, identical, then that one payment would serve as both a penalty part of the 2-fold payment as well as the 1/5 surcharge. Remember that 1/5 surcharge is an apology, in the actual fact, almost a confessionary atonement, an apology to the person that he stole from and lied to, which is different to the penalty. That's just to clap him, so he wouldn't do it again. And the asham offering is an apology and an atonement to Hashem. Okay, so that's where that obviously comes from. And these are the words of Rabbi Yaakov. Now, if we remember that the sages didn't agree, because they said that if you read the verse, and the verse stated in Numbers, Bamidbar, chapter 5, verse 7, and he shall return that which he sent in its principal amount, and its 1/5 he shall add to it. And then in a different pasuk entirely, in Vayikra, in Leviticus chapter 5, verse 25, it talks about the Hashem offering, and he shall bring his Hashem offering to Hashem. So there we learn that basically money that is not paid in the principal amount alone, but rather in the multiple of the principal, meaning that witness that he lied. It's not like he came clean before the witnesses were there, but only afterwards. So therefore, he got caught lying and stealing. So therefore, the penalty payment kicks into play. In that case, he doesn't pay 1/5, because you can't atone according to the rabbis if you have to pay a penalty because you've already lied and stolen. It's one thing before you lied and stolen if you weren't caught out and you came clean, but it doesn't get you off the hook from paying the Asham offering, because that's to Hashem and it's found in a different pasuk. Now, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai said that you don't pay the 5th nor the Asham in a place where there's a twofold payment. Okay, so that's where we ended off last time. Okay, and Gavin actually articulated it quite well. Thanks, Gav. Appreciate that yesterday. Now, the Brisa states at any rate that his 1/5 surcharge is accounted for with a twofold payment, obviously providing the amounts are identical. These are the words of Rav Yaakov. So we're trying to see a place in which the ruling applies. So the Gemara says, if you say that it applies where originally the deposit that the custodian declared stolen was worth 4 zuzim, and in the end it was worth 4 zuzim. So what are we talking about? The 4 zuzim in the beginning and the end. How do we work that out, guys?
Kevin, you want to try?
No, I can give it a bash. I'm feeling a bit better, but I might be wrong. So this is a disclaimer. Okay, so it's based on the time of the theft and the time of the value, not the court date.
Okay.
The appreciation of when the values, if it's the difference in the appreciation or depreciation.
Yeah, I think you're mostly there. I think let's try and simplify it, is that there are two considerations. The one consideration is your actual principal amount, that you're compensating for the original value of what was stolen. Okay? That's your first concept of the principle. The second concept is your penalty amount, which is the kanas, which is referred to as the kefil, same thing, which is your twofold, fourfold, or fivefold payment, depending on what you stole. If it's a normal inanimate object, or a donkey even, that's a live normal animal, it's twofold. If it's a sheep, it's fourfold. If it's an ox, it's fivefold. So in other words, if it's a sheep, it's basically threefold for the penalty and one-fold for the actual compensatory amount. If it's an ox, it's fourfold for the penalty and one-fold for the actual compensation of the principal stolen. Now, Rav was saying that we worked out the principal at the time when the object was stolen, and the penalty is worked out at the time of court. But there's a little discerning difference, is that if the court date was in August, but he slaughtered or sold the animal in July, it can't be worked out at what its value was at the court date. It's technically set at the court date, but it's actually when it occurs, because it changed status at the point where the thief no longer had it, either because he no longer had possession or it didn't resemble anything like the living creature the homeowner came to love. So then if that occurred if Fluffy died in July and the court date was in September, you pay for how Fluffy died in July, the penalty. So that's what we're saying in a nutshell. Although I don't think people had so much affection for their working animals, although I have an affection for the car. So if the car ends up backing up, I also get sad. So who knows how they felt about their animals. But the thing of it is the one thing, Kevin, it's not only appreciation, it's about appreciation or depreciation. You said that there's certain factors that affect who pays for the appreciation or depreciation. If the thief himself was to blame or to benefit. In other words, he overly indulged the animal with food. He doesn't have to pay the penalty at which he looked after the animal super well. Okay, just muted Arthur's daughter there. So, we're saying then the original owner of that article doesn't have to be compensated multiple penalties when the thief could have starved the animal, beaten it, or made it sick, and in fact looked after it super well. So the original owner isn't entitled to benefit from that additional looking after. However, if the animal appreciated in value because it grew and it developed, in that particular case, the owner can get the benefit simply because it's natural for an animal to appreciate. It's nothing that the thief did. If the animal went up by price fluctuation or the article went up like a Chardonnay because now it's a special, unique order from California instead of your local wineyard in Cape Town because that vineyard closed up, then obviously that appreciation due to price fluctuation, the owner of that Chardonnay would get because the thief in fact deprived him of that by stealing it. So that's fine. Now, if there's appreciation, Kev, because the thief made the animal sick by overworking it or beating it or neglecting it or not feeding it, then the thief has to pay the original owner for that at the time when the animal was in its best condition and not when it was getting sick. Why? Because as Rashi said, the point is that even though Rav says it's paid at the point of slaughter, you can consider an animal half dead at the point at which it starts to physically deteriorate from sickness. Okay? Tosfot doesn't agree. He's saying that when it's proper shechted or slaughtered, at that point the animal has changed its value, so that's when you pay, which is at the time of being sold or slaughtered, but not at the time where it begins to get sick, because that's not a kosher shechting. And either way, they seem to come to a conclusion, it would seem, Rashi and Tosfot, that it's not the owner's fault of that article if the thief made it depreciating it by beating it or half working it to death or starving it. So then, because the thief caused that loss, it's not the original owner's loss, so that then is paid at the time of the theft. But in normal cases, it's the principal is paid in the time of theft and the penalty at the time at which the animal changes its status by being sold or slaughtered. And we say at the time of court because that's when the case is heard. So I think Kevin's got a pretty good grasp of it. I hope you don't mind, guys, if I just articulated it a little bit differently.
No.
This thing quite a bit. But there's something that we're going to learn coming up about that if an animal actually appreciates not due to increasing in body size or normal growth, but endocrinological change, meaning it goes from an infant to a sexually mature animal, that it's a much more complicated issue, not like I thought. It's like Kevin had a gut feeling about. So, Kevin, well done for that. We're going to address it. There's a question that's asked with this Rav Yaakov, and this issue that's coming up is it's talking about the identical payment between the 1/5 surcharge as an atonement to the person that you lied to and stole from. The Hashem offering to Hashem is a completely different issue. But that 1/5 surcharge, if it's part of the penalty payment, if they match up, then you don't have to pay it twice. If the amounts are not identical, you have to make the careful payment first, because how can you be sorry if you haven't paid back? You can't be sorry. It's not taken seriously. So therefore, the amount of the penalty would be paid back to the principal, and then the 1/5 atonement, Kevin, surcharge to the person. Person's not going to accept your apology unless you paid them back penalties as well as the principal. And Hashem doesn't accept the asham unless you've paid them back. So we're saying, as far as the kefil payment, matching with the 1/5 surcharge for the apology, the atonement, when the amounts match according to Rav Yaakov, it's fine. So we're saying on a practical level, how could they match? So we're going to study this. So if you give a case where originally, at the time of theft, it was worth 4 zuzim, okay? So you had a custodian, kept it for himself, declared it stolen. At that time, it was worth 4 zuzim. And in the end, it was worth 4 zuzim, as Kevin quite rightly said. At that period of time, witnesses came against him in court. Now, it might or might not have appreciated or depreciated in value. If we say in both factors, when it was stolen, it was worth 4 zuz, and when it came to trial, it was worth 4 zuz, is there appreciation or depreciation, guys?
How much was it worth?
So repeat that again, please.
If it was
the other amount,
4 zuz, both at the beginning of the end, there was no then appreciation or depreciation, obviously.
Yeah.
Obviously. So they're saying, fine, in a case like that, the question is, can Rav Yaakov then rule that his 1/5 surcharge is accounted for his twofold payment? Okay, so why is it saying the 4 zuzim and 4 zuzim? Well, it's obviously getting this from the Brisa. So it's saying then, how can Rav Yaakov bring a ruling in that case? Because if you look at the 1/5 surcharge, if the kefil payment amounts to 4 zuzim, because according to Rav, the kefil payment is based at the time of court. So we're saying the end payment is 4 zuz, which is at the time of court. Then in that particular case, the kefil payment is 4 zuz. Then we're dealing then with a keg of wine. What's the proof? Because Kevin, if I say that the principal is 4 zuz, and I say the penalty is 4 zuz, then I'm dealing with an inanimate object or a donkey, but I'm not dealing with a sheep or an ox because you're paying back double. That's the first thing that we've got to learn from this. Okay? Second thing is that we've got to learn from this is that can Rav Yaakov rule that his 1/5 surcharge is accounted for with his twofold payment? Why? The kefil payment amounts to 4 zuzim, whereas the 1/5 surcharge amounts only to a zuz. So it's a problem because we're saying that how could you use this as an example for Rav Yaakov? Because in order for the kefil payment and the 1/5 surcharge to basically be accounted for in one kefil payment is that they're identical. But the kefil is a surcharge based on the principle. So if it hasn't devalued or appreciated, then it started off at 4 zuz, it ended off at 4 zuz, then the penalty is 4 zuz, but then the principle is 4 zuz, because your penalty mimics the same value as the principle when it's an inanimate object or a normal animal. So then it's saying then in that case, how could you say in this case that it would hit Rav Yaakov's version? Because the surcharge and the principle of what is stolen, that's what you're paying the surcharge on, the principle, would be a zuz. But yet the kefil payment is 4 zuz. So in this particular case, it wouldn't work. Are you with me? So far, it doesn't work. All agreed at least on that. Now, there's another question that comes to mind is, well, what are you talking about here in terms of 1 zuz? If I say to you, what's 25% of 4 zuz? It's 4/5 of a zuz. Why? Because if I say to you 400%, what is 1/5 of 400%, guys?
Like 85 or something.
A fifth of 400%.
Yeah.
400.
Oh, you're right, Kevin. I think Kevin's right. Yeah. About 75.
80, I got there.
Correct. So The thing of it is, how then do we work out 100 of 1 zuz? It's 4/5 of a zuz, 80%. It's exactly it. That's exactly it. Because if you take 80 Rand times 5, it's 400 Rand. Okay, so how do we get 100 Rand? That's the question you need to ask yourself. So it depends how you do the calculation. Do you do it inside or outside? Does anybody remember the principle of inside or outside? Guys, if you don't, you can ask me.
No,
All right. So I could say...
I do, but okay, just carry on.
No, I'm listening.
Yeah.
Gavin, the floor's all yours, buddy.
No, I don't remember properly. It's either whether you incorporate it inside the 4, so you take a percentage of within that amount, or it's external to that amount.
Excellent.
So
Perfect answer. Perfect answer. Perfect. So that's exactly it. If you want to incorporate it externally, let's take an amount where I say to you that if I say to you that you take 200 zuz, okay, and you take 600 zuz. Take 600 zuz as an ox, right? And I say to you that you need to add a third to it to beautify the mitzvah. Okay? Does it mean then that you're paying 900 zuz? Or is it a third of 600, which is 200 zuz? Because 600 divided by 3 is 200 zuz each. 600 plus 200 is 800. So am I paying 800 zuz? Or do I take 900 zuz and divide it by 3, which is 300 zuz each, and say that it's actually 300 zuz is 1/3? Or do I say it's 800 zuz because I've taken the 600 and added a third to that? So 600 divided by 3 is 200 zuz each, and I added that to the 600 to get 800 zuz. Kabb, do you understand what I'm saying? If you don't, I can...
I'm flittering my mind's like...
Okay. So if
what was the principal amount?
No, the principal, I'm saying the principal amount is 4 zuz, but I'm using an example of how we get to the surcharge of 1/5 being a zuz and not 4/5 of a zuz. In other words, don't think of it as 4 zuz. Think of it as 400 zuz. It's an easier way. That's the first thing I want you to do, guys. This is my own equation. Say that you took an article worth 400 zuz. And at the end of the day, it was only worth 400 zuz in terms of the penalty, because it was either a donkey or an inanimate object. But the donkey was worth 400 zuz, right? What I'm saying is, if you killed the donkey and that you didn't appreciate in value or depreciate, you'd have to give back 400 zuz, because it's not an ox or a sheep, because that's what it was worth at the time it was stolen, and at the time where you slaughtered it, it was still worth 400 zuz. So you pay that in the penalty and you pay 400 zuz back. Okay? So that's clear. Now, 1/5 surcharge in terms of the atonement portion, where afterwards you were caught by witnesses and you said, listen, I did wrong. I stole it and I lied about it. Then you pay that atonement according to Rav Yaakov and the Asham offering. But that atonement would actually be 100 zuz. So why is it 100 zuz, not 80 zuz? Okay? Firstly, because if you take 400, Kevin, okay, and you divide it by, if you take 25%, 1/5 of 400, it's 80 zuz. If you say 80 rand or 80 zuz times 5, you get 400 rand or 400 zuz. So the question is, how does it work at to be 100 zuz or 100 rand note and not 80 rand note? So Gavin answered correctly. It depends if you work it in or out. So let me tell you what I'm talking about, this in or out principle. I'm going to Just scrap this 400 zuz example right now. Let's go back to basics when we were talking about buying a lulav in etrog and beautifying the mitzvah. And we discussed that you spend up to 1/3 more on the mitzvah. Remember that? And it says, do we spend 800 shekels or do we spend 900 shekels? Why? Because if your Mahuda, beautiful set, was worth 1/3 extra, but your average set was worth 600 shekels, right? Kevin, 600 divided by 3 is what?
200.
Fine. So if I'm saying I'm spending 200 zuz more than 600, how many zuz am I spending?
800.
Correct, 800 zuz. That's one way to work on the calculation, where you add it to the base amount. Then the other way to work out the calculation is to say the Mahuda set is 900 zuz, and you divide 900 by 3 equals what?
300.
300. So the average lulav in etrog is 600 zuz, and the Mahuda one is 900 zuz, exactly as Gavin said. So if you want to work it out from the total, then it works out to, and not, if you want to work it out from the total and you divide 400 by 5, it's 80 zuz each. But if you have a look and you say 100 zuz, if you work it out from the other way around and you say 1/5 from the total is in fact 100 if you want to exclude it from the principal amount. Does that make sense? Gav? Explain it last bit to Kevin, how we get it as 100.
At 20%.
Yeah, but it depends how you. It was the same thing with the lulav and etrog of how you decide to work it out. Do you add it? Where you're paying 400 zuz, and then you're paying 1/5 of that in terms of your surcharge. Okay, so the 400 would be the primary amount. So in other words, your 400 is your primary amount, and that extra 100 would be a quarter of the total. It would be 20. It would actually be how do
100.
you 100. That's exactly why you pay 1 zuz. Does that make sense, Gav?
Yeah.
Okay. So, in other words, the 1/5 surcharge on 4 zuzim is a zuz rather than 4/5 of a zuz, because the 1/5 from the outside, it's the 1/5 of the total, the final total of the principal plus the surcharge, because the surcharge is added to that. Does that make sense? So the surcharge is 1/4 of the principal. In other words, if you divide something to 4 parts and then add another identical part, that adds 1/5 to the total. So if you say you're not dividing it by 4, but it's the 4 is the principal, and you're adding 1/5 to that, so that your total plus the principal equals the 1/5, then you get 100 zuz, because it's 400 zuz for the principal plus 100 zuz is 500 zuz. If you take 500 zuz divided by 5, it's 100 zuz each. So you've added the 1/5 surcharge to the principal. That's how you get 100 zuz instead of 80 zuz. You added it. That's the bottom line. Does that make sense, Kevin? In other words, in the one case, you've included it, in the other case, you added it. So, for example, if we talk a lulav and etrog, and you divided it, we've already added the Mahuda version and divided it backwards, where you get 3 portions at 300 zuz each. So the average set is 2/3 of that, which is 600 zuz. Okay, so it's already worked out from the total. Whereas if you have a look and say 600 zuz and you add the Mahuda to that, it's 1/3 of 600, which is 200 zuz, meaning a total of 800 zuz. So the one you added as a surcharge to make it Mahuda, and the other one you get it from the total and divided by 3. And the other one you added from the base amount. Am I making any sense, Kev? Or you're not feeling 100%?
Yeah, I think I understand the.
You understand?
You see, that's how they. Yeah, I do. Yeah, sure. That's how they.
Also, come onto the screen for the last minute for the YouTube video.
I don't know if you see, he hears you.
I don't even know if he's attended this year. Oh dear. Well, and malasot, as they say in the classics.